Hi, and welcome to this week's presentation. Each week I'm doing a fairly short discussion of books or law or politics, or usually all three. These are short by podcast or lecture standards, but long by TikTok standards. So this week, Senate Republicans voted to kill a bipartisan commission to look into the January 6th insurrection. They're also trying to outlaw teaching critical race theory in schools. Critical race theory is an academic framework centered on the idea that racism is systemic and not just demonstrated by individual people with prejudices. The theory sort of holds that racial inequality is woven into the legal system. Now, a law banning the teaching of this theory in schools would be an unconstitutional violation of the First Amendment, but that's not stopping the Republicans from trying. So what the heck is going on? I think I can sum up the Republican Party in one picture. You see, these guys never went away. For the past 5 decades or so, they were shamed into silence. Who are the guys in this picture? They were pro-slavery activists from Missouri who traveled to Kansas in the 1850s to fight against the abolitionists. They were defenders of the plantation system. I'm stating the obvious here, but the Confederacy was decidedly anti-democratic. So it's really no shock that one of our two parties is anti-democratic. There are lots of guys around like this, and they want a party too. So in a book called Demagogue for President by Texas A&M University professor Jennifer Mercieca, she wrote about Trump's rhetorical strategies. Basically, she explains how Trump awakened the sleeping Confederates and border ruffians and turned them into insurrectionists. Now they look like this. When you think about it, unleashing them and turning them into insurrectionists wasn't hard. They were always insurrectionists, literally. Now, Mercieca's book continues to be important because, first, Republicans who apparently want to be the next Trump are imitating these tactics, and Trump is continuing to use these tactics in his defense and to keep control of the Republican Party, which he, with help from his friends, is doing by keeping guys like these stirred up. So the second book I want to mention is called How Fascism Works by Yale professor Jason Stanley. These two books describe the same phenomenon, one from the viewpoint of a philosopher and the other from the viewpoint of a professor of rhetoric. Professor Mercieca presents Trump as a master con artist. She says his gaffes weren't really gaffes. They were deliberate and masterful uses of aggressive debate tricks. She explains her use of the word genius in the title. She says Trump is a master at manipulating people through standard rhetorical devices. She says he ingeniously wields communication as a force in a way that makes it difficult to respond to him. I won't march through all the devices. It's a long, comprehensive book, but I'll hit on a few that most struck me. The first is what Mercieca calls appeal to the crowd. Basically, Trump tells his supporters that they're smart enough to see through the manipulation of the fake media. He tells them that America's problems are not their fault. They are the victims of corrupt and inept politicians. Here's the definition she gives. Appeal to the crowd is used by a demagogue to praise his or her supporters as wise, good, and knowledgeable. By means of this device, Trump, a liar and consummate salesperson, conned his supporters into thinking he was a truth teller. He did this by positioning his own, quote, lack of political correctness as genuineness. He also positioned being politically correct as being scripted and basically going along with corruption. His supporters bought it. The result was that the more outrageous Trump's language became, the more truthful and less corrupt he appeared to be to his supporters. I know someone who voted for Trump. She said Trump tells it like it is. I asked, tells what like it is? I received no answer. Mercieca says that the impulse of Trump's critics to mock him backfired by solidifying his position as a man of the people who is mocked by the establishment, which is a tricky feat for someone who claims to be a billionaire real estate mogul. Trump's argument was annoyingly circular. Trump is right because all the people support him, and all the people support him because he's right. All right, device number 2. This is one that we heard Trump use repeatedly. This is when Trump attacks his opponent's character. The thing to notice about this device is that attacking the person diverts attention away from the debated question. People focus on the attack. Trump's critics assume that the very nature of the attacks that he launches will reflect badly on Trump, but in the process, people entirely forget about the underlying criticism that prompted Trump to attack. So, for example, when Trump talked about the highly untalented Washington Post blogger Jennifer Rubin, he called her a real dummy. Used the word dummy. He then went on to say, she never writes fairly about me. Why does the Washington Post have low IQ people? This was so outrageous that who then remembers what Rubin's criticism of Trump was that prompted this attack? It's because our attention is completely absorbed by the spectacle of a president or a candidate for president talking this way about a well-known journalist. So the device works, even if it doesn't turn you against Rubin. But the people who it's directed to, his supporters, then understand now that they're not supposed to listen to anything Rubin says or writes in the Post because she treats Trump unfairly. Now, when other people try to use these techniques, it often flops. So remember, for example, when Marco Rubio tried to mark Trump's small hands. Rubio later regretted trying this. And so, some people on social media talk about projection. They say Trump accuses other people of doing what he's doing. In fact, he often does seem to be doing this. Just to take one example, during the Mueller investigation, he kept asserting without evidence that there was no collusion except between crooked Hillary and the Democrats. Okay, so this is a rhetorical device which basically says my critics have no standing to critique me because they've done it or worse themselves. The user of this device is attempting to find a contradiction in one's opponent's words or between the words and the deeds. Basically, through all of this, what Trump did is unleashed the ugly. It's worth noting that most people have the decency not to use or even consider using these kinds of rhetorical strategies. These techniques are aggressive, ugly, mean, and designed to destroy. Normal people just don't do it. This brings me to the next rhetorical device called paralypsis, which is hugely important. In fact, I think paralypsis might be the vocabulary word of the decade. It means saying something while claiming not to be saying it. Here's a playful example. I'm going to be nice today. I'm not going to call Jeb Bush low energy. I'm not going to repeat it. I'm not going to say that Marco Rubio is a lightweight. A less playful example, during the 2016 campaign, when Trump retweeted an unnamed lawyer who explained that Rubio and Cruz couldn't become president because they weren't natural-born citizens. Later, Trump insisted that all he did was retweet it. When George Stephanopoulos confronted him, Trump said, let people make their own determination. I never looked at it, George. I honestly never even looked at it. As someone said, he's not eligible. This gives Trump deniability. It lets him spread innuendo without accountability. More recently, after calling his supporters together for a Stop the Steal rally, and after riling them up and telling them that the election was being stolen and Pence had the power to stop it, Trump told his supporters at the Stop the Steal rally to fight like hell, and then he pointed them toward the Capitol. He also said, be peaceful. When they did fight like hell, Trump said he didn't mean fight literally because he also said peaceful. And besides, he said, Elizabeth Warren says fight all the time. There's the appeal to hypocrisy. I didn't really say it. Notice, this is basically the same defense that Giuliani put forward that I talked about last week. I said it, but I didn't say it. One of my followers on Twitter gave this example of paralypsis. I'm not saying she needs to lose weight, needs to lose a few pounds, but. So when Trump uses these devices, his followers and supporters feel like they're in on a joke. They applaud his deliberate ambiguity, which they understand lets him escape accountability. At the same time, they think he's being genuine in saying how he really feels. This is how a fan responded to Trump's disavowal of white supremacy. When confronted by the fact that David Duke supported him, Trump claimed not to know anything about David Duke. He said, I know nothing about white supremacists. Later, he said he had a bad earpiece and he couldn't hear correctly. How did the white supremacists react? I love it when Trump plays dumb. Here's an observation. Marjorie Taylor Greene, the representative from Georgia, thinks that the way to imitate Trump is to be as vulgar as possible and to try to create the maximum amount of outrage. But what I get from this book is that successfully deploying these devices is a skill that not everyone possesses. It seems to me that Greene does lack Trump's sort of evil genius for using these devices. Now, other devices from the book include exceptionalism. America is the greatest, but our enemies from within are weakening America, and I alone can fix it. Reification, which means treating people like objects. Now, if you've studied fascism and fascist tactics, you're probably thinking, wait, I've seen all this before. Well, there is a lot of overlap between these rhetorical strategies and fascist tactics outlined by scholars like Jason Stanley. For example, some of the rhetorical devices Mercieca describes are designed to unify the supporters and increase the polarization between the demagogue supporters and everyone else. Jason Stanley describes fascist tactics as creating an us versus them politics. One of Stanley's points, in fact, is that Trump is cynically using a set of fascist tactics to seize and maintain power. Yes, there's a striking similarity between the rhetorical strategies Mercieca describes and fascist tactics. In fact, Robert Paxton, in a book called The Anatomy of Fascism, said that the world's first fascists were not the Italians under Mussolini. The first fascists were the Ku Klux Klan, who were, of course, trying to recreate the plantation system. Fascists dehumanize their enemies, reification. Nazis called the Jews vermin, which led to extermination. Fascist leaders create spectacle. I did a video earlier called Crisis in Spectacle. It's number 6. I started with a series of short videos going back and giving some background information about how we got here. And creating spectacle is an important part of how fascists govern. No surprise, fascist leaders are masters at these techniques. Fascist leaders also lack the moral compass that prevents most people from using these kinds of tactics. That's why they're fascists. So what do? Well, educating people to recognize these tactics will help. But Mercieca points out that educating people is tricky because these rhetorical devices are specifically designed to prevent people from using their critical thinking skills. Now, for people who can understand, a book like this helps. It's nice to have a word like paralypsis to describe what we're seeing. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about Trump's motion to dismiss Falwell's lawsuit. Last week, I talked about Giuliani's motion to dismiss Falwell's case against him. Trump now is trying to get the case against him dismissed. No surprise, Trump is raising a First Amendment defense. Last week, I explained that speech loses its First Amendment protection when there's an incitement to imminent lawlessness. Trump's defense, also no surprise, is that he couldn't possibly have incited lawless action because he told the protesters to be peaceful when he sent them to the Capitol. Trump is basically relying on the rhetorical strategy of paralypsis for his First Amendment defense. Well, that's obviously a weak argument, so he added a few other defenses. First, he argued that he cannot be held accountable in court for things he did while he was president. I thought about doing a full presentation on the ridiculousness of that argument, but it's just too ridiculous, and it's already been rejected by the Supreme Court. When Trump tried to pull the absolute immunity defense to keep his tax records out of the hands of prosecutors, the Supreme Court said no, a president does not have absolute immunity from other investigations. Now, in this brief, he tries to argue that the separations of powers means that other branches of government have no right to judge how he conducted his presidency. And then he says rousing speeches were part of how he conducted his presidency. Yes, we have separation of powers, but that doesn't mean each branch can do it as it likes without oversight. The branches act as checks on each other. That's why Congress has the power to impeach and remove a president. And that's why courts can overturn legislation passed by Congress if it isn't constitutional. So Trump is simply wrong that the courts have no authority to judge his behavior if it was illegal. Now, courts do make mistakes. As I mentioned last week, they don't always get things right, but I'll be shocked if a court grants either of these motions. In fact, I'm actually looking forward to what the court has to say. Anyway, thank you for joining me. I'll be back again next week with another of these short presentations, and I hope you'll join me. If you have any ideas or suggestions, please leave them in the comments. Thank you.